being Adem. Dr. Adem is an Associate Director of the Institute of Global Cultural Studies and Associate Research Professor of Political Science at SUNY Binghamton. Professor Adem comes from Ethiopia and holds a PhD in International Political Economy from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. He has published 8 books and is editor of the book China's Diplomacy in Eastern and Southern Africa. We will talk about the sociology of discourse in China-Africa relations from an African perspective.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to attend this symposium and be part of it. I'm also very grateful for the word hospitality. Okay, I have also a one-page PowerPoint, which is kind of outline of my presentation. What I try to do is basically to debunk 3 assumptions on which Sino-optimism is based. Assumption number 1, that China never colonized Africa. I use empirical evidence and logic to kind of challenge this assumption. And then the assumption that China supported Africa's liberation movements. I use the concept or the idea of historical relativism to challenge that too. And China's intentions are different this time. I try to debunk that by relying on the concept of agency. But some background. Mao said after China was admitted to the United Nations Security Council in 1971, quote, "It is our African brothers that carried us into the United Nations." Now the question is, can we Africans also say, quote, "It was our Chinese brothers and sisters who carried us into the 21st century"? This is a defensible proposition. Since the 1990s, as already mentioned today, China has effectively ended the steady marginalization of Africa in global political economy by making possible the revival or even a rise of the demand, world demand for primary commodities such as agricultural products and minerals. Of course, China's behavior sometimes has been criticized, especially by the West. But this type of criticism, in my view, is really ironic because the critics seem to expect China to demand from Africa a higher democratic standard than what is practiced by China itself. Moreover, many of these critics make generally no issue about the economic engagement of the West with the same China. In any case, the discourse in Africa about China-Africa relations creates those who see China in wolf's clothing, or those who see China as a wolf in sheep's clothing, or the Sino-pessimists, and those who see China as a force for good in Africa, the Sino-optimists. I am less optimistic about the long-term impact of China in Africa, but I should also admit that the prevailing mood in Africa today is generally one of optimism at all levels. And the view I am articulating today is not shared by many compatriots of mine in Africa at this point. If so, the question is, why should I decide to present this view or this perspective? My answer is simply because as a scholar, it is also my role to question what people have naturalized or accepted as self-evident truths. So I will seek to substantiate a less optimistic view of mine, one could even say it is a silent pessimistic view, by problematizing the implications of some of the claims, three interrelated specific claims on which Sino-optimism is based. So these are not the only claims, but these are some of the major claims on which Sino-optimistic view is based. First one is that China never colonized Africa. Because China never colonized Africa, Sino-optimists claim it would not be a new colonial power. This type of argument, I think, does not stand to logical scrutiny and empirical evidence. Logically, the fact that China never colonized Africa does not ipso facto make it immune to accusation of neo-colonial behavior. After all, the US, a country which has never had a colony in Africa, is sometimes vulnerable to the charges of neo-colonialism in the same way as ex-colonial powers. Theoretically, nothing prevents China from working out or from trying to work out a new form of colonial or dependent relationship with African countries. Within the context of this reasoning, China's rhetoric of win-win relationship with Africa is sometimes seen as a discourse thus calibrated for this very purpose in our own time. History also teaches us that rhetoric of power does acquire from time to time the meaning of benevolence when employed in a colonial setting. Empirically, aspects of China's current behaviors in Africa also resemble what European powers have done in Africa in the colonial period and beyond. In Sino-African economic exchange today, we see the perpetuation of economic independency and structural distortions which have been introduced in Africa by colonialism and global capitalism, including export bias, in which the production of cash crops are given priority over food crops for local consumption, and urban bias, in which the needs of the countryside is subordinated to the needs of urban population. The second assumption on which Sino-optimism is based is that China supported Africa's national liberation movements. It is true China has supported national liberation movements in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, even if it sometimes supported the wrong ones. China also spearheaded one of the major post-colonial infrastructure projects in Africa, the Tazara Railways, as already mentioned. Over the decades, China has significantly contributed to primary aid in Africa as well. China's support for Africa when Africa was in need of support has been both solid and time-tested. But the China of the 1960s and 1970s is not the same as China of today. China today is seemingly turning Africans into, quote, the poorest of food and drawers of water, end of quote. The structure of China's trade with Africa shows China is not that much different from countries of Europe and North America. The bulk of Africa's exports the bulk of China's exports to Africa is manufactured goods, and from Africa to China, primarily commodities. The structure of African economies is not China's creation, of course, but the point is one should not continue to do the same thing and expect a different result. One does not have to be a Marxist to assert that the logic of capital is the same, irrespective of who is in the driving seat. And the last assumption I try to challenge is that China's intentions are different. Chinese leaders often speak about China and Africa as all-weather friends. Africa's leaders also echo similar sentiments. Actually, I have one quotation from the president of South Africa, in which he says, "We certainly are convinced that China's intention is different from that of Europe, which today continues to intend to influence African countries for its own sole benefit." Mr. Zuma, the president of South Africa's observation has certain persuasiveness, even though a claim about the intention of others is always a guesswork to some extent. Such a statement also overestimates the extent to which individuals or collectivities could influence outcomes and do so, to paraphrase Karl Marx, as they wish. We could address this issue perhaps more profitably in relation to the concept of agency, defined in terms of intentionality and power. To the extent that China's intentions are different, great, good, as Mr. Zuma and others claim, China's role in Africa could be regarded as positively agentic. But because most human actions are agentic, we should also qualify intentionality for the concept of agency to have its useful meaning. One way of doing so is to limit applicability of the concept agency only to those actions which are directed at reinterpreting, resisting, or challenging the existing structures. Here is again where we come to realize that not only is China incapable of developing Africa, its intentions too is limited since it does not necessarily aim at reinterpreting, resisting, or transforming the economic structure in Africa. Instead, China is reinforcing and reproducing the structure of dependency. Even if China's leaders and African leaders wish to change the structure of African economies, adding reflexivity to their intention and enhancing their agency, the intention remains only the necessary condition for a transformative effect to occur. And this is where the concept of agency as power takes over from the concept of agency as intention. Agency as power refers to the extent to which outcomes could be controlled and rewards could be realized. Africa's power as agency is limited at least for three reasons. First, almost all African states have not put their houses in order, the problem of so-called weak states. Second, African countries have very limited power over the range of choices they could make, and the level of control they exercise over the outcomes of their relations with China. Let us also not forget that even though the level of economic exchange between China and Africa has grown in leaps and bounds in recent years, the unequal nature of this relationship also has continued to deepen. Africa needs China more than China needs Africa. In conclusion, I am not prepared to go as far as to say that China is a wolf in sheep's clothing in Africa, because saying so would imply that China has an unconstrained agentic power in Africa, which it does not. That is to say that China by itself could neither develop nor underdevelop Africa. Another conclusion we could draw from the foregoing analysis is that Sino-African relations are bound to expand and consolidate. And a more expanded and stronger relations between China and Africa are beneficial to both sides. And yet, we do not expect, or we should not expect miracles in Africa. The prevailing conditions are simply not conducive for Africa's economic takeover. Furthermore, it is important to bear in mind that even though there is considerable overlap between China and Africa's interests at the moment, the long-term consequences of Sino-African relations is likely to be decidedly divergent. In short, Sino-optimism is unsustainable in theory and in practice. In the same speech, which is on the screen, President Zuma of South Africa also said, quote, "We Africans are particularly pleased that in our relationship with China, we are equal and that arguments entered into are for mutual gain," end of quote. African tribal chiefs in northern Nigeria, too, had felt they were free when Britain introduced its policy of indirect rule in the early 20th century. It is the type of rule which Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, later defined as the process of letting, quote, "the African chief appear nominally in control, while actually he was manipulated from behind the scenes by the colonial power." It's China's so-called no strings attached age and the rhetoric of win-win relationship with Africa, the glorified 21st century version of colonial indirect rule. Is China a neo-colonial power in the making? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to now invite all of the speakers to take a few short minutes to respond to the other panelists' presentations. Can we start with Ambassador Shinn?
I'm not sure this is so much a response as it is an addition that comes out of the remarks that were made by others. I think think it's on the issue of the Chinese communities living in Africa today. I certainly agree with Professor Fei-Ling's numbers of somewhere between 1 and 2 million Chinese living in Africa today. That's, I think, the estimate that most people who are following this topic use, albeit there's a wide variation between 1 and 2 million. But what's more important, I think, is to look at what constitutes that 1 to 2 million Chinese. First off, you have a fairly significant group, particularly in South Africa, but also in Madagascar, Mauritius, and even the Seychelles, of a very old Chinese community that in the case of Madagascar dates back to the 1700s. In the case of South Africa, it dates back to the late 1800s and comes forward. And these are people, some of them now are essentially South African nationals, but they still very much maintain their Chinese identity. That is one component of this community. No one knows what the numbers are. It's probably among perhaps as many as half of the number in South Africa. In the other countries, it's a relatively minor proportion of the current Chinese population. There are, in my view, 3 other categories of community, Chinese community in Africa, that are important to distinguish among. One is what I would simply call the professional group, that is those Chinese who are in charge of embassies, aid programs, large state-owned companies. These are the Chinese who are living in the international community, interact with other international members of the community on an equal basis, speak one of the local languages, whether it be English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, etc., and pretty much intermingle along with everyone else in the international community. They're people who come for a limited period of time, then go back to China, maybe go to some other part of the world, maybe do 1 or 2 tours in Africa at some point. The second group is one over which there's a great deal of mythology, and that is the laborers, the semi-skilled, sometimes unskilled laborers that come out in large numbers under contract, usually full plane loads at a time, spend a year, maybe 2 years on contract in Africa. They come primarily because they can earn a slightly higher pay in Africa than they would earn in comparable jobs in China. They leave their families behind. They speak no language other than their Chinese dialect. So they can't really interact with the Africans except through hand motions. They have almost no social interaction with the Africans, and they do engage each other in the workforce or in the workplace, and that's about it. This group, for the most part, is more than happy to go back to China after they're finished with their contract. They can't wait to get on the plane out of Africa. The odd one will stay on as an acupuncturist or maybe set up a Chinese restaurant, and occasionally you'll have intermarriage, very rarely, but occasionally. For the most part, they all go home. The third and last category is the most interesting one, and these are the entrepreneurs and small traders. This is the controversial community. This is the one about which the numbers are most unknown. They do not come at the behest of the Chinese government. Many of them have no contact whatsoever with the Chinese embassy when they do arrive. They may not even be coming from China. They may be coming from some other part of the world. They come to Africa because they smell money. This is a place where they can earn more money than they can earn wherever they were working before, or so they think. They stay for considerable periods of time. They frequently live pretty much with the Africans, although there are these Chinatowns too that exist, and when in the workplace they may be separating themselves off to some extent, but some of them work side by side with the Africans in the markets, for example. They set up Chinese restaurants, they have acupuncture operations, they have agricultural projects. They're doing all kinds of things, sometimes getting into trouble in the process. Sometimes they are the bane of the existence of the Chinese embassy in the country because the Chinese embassy doesn't even know they're there until they get into trouble. So it's a very interesting component of what's going on in Africa today, and it should come as no surprise because these people have done pretty much the same thing around the world. In the United States, for example. Now it's happening in Africa. And it's interesting when we talk to some of these people, and I don't speak Mandarin, but my co-author of the book does, and when we traveled in Africa and would meet with these people, we would ask them in Chinese, how are you going to be here? Are you going back to China? And the answer was always, of course we're going back to China. And our next question was, how long have you been here? And well, 20 years, 15 years. I mean, these people were basically already settled into Africa, and yet in their minds, they're all going back to China. My guess is many of them will never go back to China. So or at least not permanently, they may go back for visits. I spend some time to make this distinction of these communities because it's one of the more interesting aspects of what China is doing in Africa today, and one about which there's an awful lot of confusion out there and a lot of misinformation, particularly in journalistic accounts as to what these communities are and what these people are doing.
I have three small points that I want to make. The first one is about the volume of Chinese investment in Africa. There is official data, but the official data is believed to be significantly underestimating the true volume because it's pointed out that a lot of the investment by the Chinese made in Africa were actually through shell companies in Cayman Island and Virgin Islands, so they did not come directly from China, so they were not counted towards China's direct FDI in Africa. Although the volume seems to be varying significantly because the Chinese official data suggests that China's cumulative FDI in Africa by the beginning of 2013 is $20 billion.
I think we have it up to maybe 22 or 23 billion.
22.
Way below the number.
Yes, so Professor Wang's number, which is 193 billion, seems to be really high. Chinese ambassador to South Africa once acknowledged to me last year that the true figure on the ground might double the China's official figure, but definitely not 10 times. So I'm wondering where that data come from. The second point I want to make is about the no string attached, or the belief that China's aid has no strings attached. Well, China's aid certainly has strings attached, just not the type of Western conditions, such as governance or transparency or anti-corruption. For one, there's a political requirement that the African government has to recognize Beijing as the sole legitimate government representing China. If there's any signs of good political relations with Taiwan, then don't even think about it. The second category, China's aid, is what we typically call tied aid. They do come with specific requirements. For example, infrastructure projects require the African governments to hire Chinese construction companies to construct roads and bridges, hospitals, and schools. And Chinese media has floated this number saying that for 1 RMB, basically 16 cents of aid that China provides to Africa, China will take back 6 RMB, so which is $1. So for 1 RMB that China contributes to Africa, China will get back $1. So I certainly wouldn't think that aid is selfishness and altruistic. The third point is about the nature of China's involvement and engagement in Africa, which Dr. Adem argued whether it is sheep in wolf's clothes. I would argue that China's involvement in Africa economical engagements are benign but not altruistic. China does not want to dictate terms in African governments. They have no interest as to democratization or telling the African leaders what they should do in terms of their domestic policies. But what they do pursue is China's own economic interest, either through business contracts, such as infrastructure projects or natural resources exploitation in inside Africa. I would say that the true test of whether China is Africa's real friend or whether China's intention is truly altruistic is when Africa's interest and China's interests do not align, and then what choice China is going to make. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to be very brief because I want to leave some time to hear from you guys in the audience. Very quickly, the total volume of FDI from China and Africa. So you're actually right. The estimate is probably sort of obviously, it's just they don't match. The numbers I used here is starting from actually open source. It's in my paper. I'd be happy to forward to you. This is open source. But my suspicion is that actually the real number probably is even larger than that. If you think this is large, I think the real number is larger because just recently the Chinese government put out some big projects in South Africa with $10 billion petrochemical industry. In Ghana alone, one project $2 billion. So it's not unthinkable to think that the real number is much higher than official numbers. I wouldn't be surprised, even though I cited that from the source. But the real number probably is larger than that. Okay, very quickly to the why good Africa. I want to make a little comment, a little addition to Ambassador Shinn's excellent description about Chinese in Africa. I think we basically agree that many Chinese, or at least verbally, or they say they don't want to live forever. They want to go, and basically the one who say, if I make money, if I make my fortune, I go to Canada. If I don't make my fortune, if I don't make my money, I go back to China. Of course, it's not just Canada. It's actually Canada, Australia, blah, blah, blah. The United States is the last one. Why? Because, quote, it's most difficult getting the United States. Anyhow, so that's basically the kind of response you get nominally. But in reality, they have been there for almost they start to have babies there also. So it's like what? So I agree with that. But a little comment on that is that why do Chinese go to Africa? I actually did ask a nasty question, why do you come here? Right? A number of times I asked that. And anecdotally, I would say, and Dr. Shinn is correct, many of them are actually centered. They don't want to be there. They just want to get the job done and go home, right? And they say, and another reason is, why I'm here? I couldn't get to Europe. I can't go to America, so I come here. Going here abroad is only fun. So just to go abroad, that's one thing. Just leave China. And then you have a sub reason why they want to go abroad. A number of reasons. I don't want to cite them here. Too much, too complicated. But some of the reasons are very interesting, very peculiar, and kind of surprising to me was one common reason cited by Chinese in Africa why you are here is actually, quote, it's freer here. It's more free here, more frequent here. And second common answer is it's easier to make money here, which may be true. And thirdly, officials here are easy to deal with. And fourth, I think one and four. The fourth reason is food here are testing. Seriously, that's what air cleaner, food testing. So that's the final comment very quickly to you. In terms of whether China is behaving like a new colonial power in Africa, it's a very difficult question. I guess we really don't have enough time here to debate on that or have a conclusive answer to that. But I want to actually support you by offering a little observation regarding the pattern trade between China and Africa. You're absolutely correct. The basic trade pattern between Africa and China is almost identical as the basic trade pattern between Europe and Africa, or between US and Africa. That is, Africa sells raw material, energy, buys manufactured goods, identical, with almost no deviation, almost no difference at all. So that, in that regard, you could say Chinese are not behaving very differently from Westerners.
Yes, very briefly, let me start with the relationship between my presentation and other presentations. I looked at slightly different dimension of Sino-African relations. So basically, there is more agreement between me and my colleagues here, even though I looked at the long-term effect of China's relations with Africa. And another point I'd like to clarify is that I did not really say that China has been ill intention at the moment. What I suggested was that intentions also do change when there's change, when identity change. So that is the point.
Thank you very much. We will now open the floor to questions. Please introduce yourself and make the question very brief.
I have a question specific to Professor Wang. You did mention in your presentation about the increasing military influence of China and Africa. And my question is it a really far-fetched correlation between China's military interest or military influence and China and the very prominent armed proliferation issues now in Africa, especially in the Sub-Saharan region? And a footnote for my question is that on April 15th, there's an article published on the Chicago Tribune. Basically, context that China transport 23 tons of military weapons through Ivory Coast to its peacekeeping mission in Mali. And when the international community is still debating the true purpose and the true location, the destination for the 22 tons of military weapons, we have to understand actually the fact that China has a very big economic interest and natural resources pursued in Niger in terms of the uranium mineral resources and also the iron resources in Mauritania and also their oil resources interest in Nigeria. So yeah, that's my question. And also the list provided by Chinese government actually has only total weight around 3,000 kilograms. So that's a very huge difference between the two numbers.
May I ask, are you a student here or faculty member?
Yes, sorry. Yeah. I am a graduate student, second year master.
Right. Very quickly, actually, to be honest, I did not expect to find out that Chinese engaging the local governments very actively, military. I did not expect that. That's kind of a side finding. I didn't really intend to see that. But I'm also impressed that in countries like Zimbabwe and those places, the activities are obviously very active. So active that generals I met, they're actually making jokes about how much you get engaged. I don't know whether the joke really is a joke or kind of semi-reflectory of the fact. But I did learn that Zimbabwe, actually you'll be surprised to know this also, Zimbabwe actually is an Air Force. And not only Air Force, they actually fly jet planes. They're all pretty much using Chinese equipment. The weapons proliferation in Africa, especially conventional weapons, the small weapons, firearms, from China is no longer secret. I mean, a lot of tons and tons of Chinese weapons are available in Africa. But this is not really, I would say, not Chinese government responsibility, because much of the stuff actually floating around in the black market through intermediary or third party, not necessarily Chinese export directly. But I would not be surprised also that China is engaged in some kind of weapons export in Africa. I'm not surprised. Final comment on that, I would call Chinese-made jet fighters are pretty popular in Africa simply because they are powerful enough to scare the local rebels because with noise and fly over, right, and they are cheap and easy to maintain.
Could I add something to that? The Chinese military involvement in Africa is one of the areas that I particularly devoted a lot of attention to. And in terms of conventional arms transfers to Africa in the last 3 or 4 years, China now provides 25% of Africa's global arms, all the arms that Africa receives. That's up significantly from 10, 15 years ago. China has always been a supplier of some arms to Africa, but it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that it actually has surpassed Russia and countries like Belarus and Ukraine, and now is the highest at 25% of all the conventional arms transfers. That's an important distinction between conventional arms and small arms and light weapons. There are no statistics available for small arms and light weapons. My guess is the percent of small arms and light weapons from China is even higher than 25%. The dollar value for those would not be so great because they don't cost that much. But conventional weapons would be things like howitzers and armored personnel carriers and tanks and aircraft, that sort of thing. It's not 25%, according to U.S. congressional research studies that they have been doing for many, many years, and they have pretty good numbers on this. I would also add that in terms of the potential threat to Chinese shipping, and particularly oil and minerals that are going through the sea lanes of the northern Indian Ocean into the Straits of Malacca, about 85% of all of China's imported oil goes through the Straits of Malacca, and most of it comes from somewhere on either the eastern side of Africa or from the Middle East. And that is why you have why China is participating so vigorously in the anti-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. It's an effort to try to protect its own interests. Chinese ships and Chinese crews were being captured. And China saw that it was in its direct interest to get engaged in that. So you are seeing a growing involvement for its own purposes of military collaboration with the African countries. In terms of the arms transfers, that's just making money. They're selling these arms, and it's just a good way to make more money.
Hi. Hi, my name is Lee. I'm a freshman here. My question is that do you agree that China doesn't have a general strategic agenda? And given that Professor Sun just mentioned that for each 1 RMB of investment, China actually got 6 RMB in return. Would China's involvement in Africa more of a economic incentive rather than a political one? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. First of all, the quote of 1 RMB aid for 6 RMB returns, that was not from me, that was from Chinese media. It's actually directly quote from a Chinese state-owned enterprises president. As for whether China has the Africa strategy, my observation is inside the Chinese foreign policy community, their conclusion is China does not have an Africa strategy. China has different goals. It has economic goals, political goals, and ideological and security goals. But as for how to prioritize these different sets of goals, for example, whether economic interests should be China's priority in Africa, or China should pay more attention not to the political friendship between China and the continent, not to let the commercial pursuits of Chinese companies to undermine China's political relationship with Africa. That's an issue with a lot of tension in China. So from that perspective, you could argue that China does not have an African strategy. It only has short-term goals. But in the long term, the strategic thinking is not there yet.
I would like to very quickly to that comment. I agree with you that I think the Chinese government do not have the kind of master plan to conquer Africa or whatever. But I do see that this might be changing a little bit. If you read President Xi Jinping's speech in Africa closely, he did propose something that is purely uneconomical pursuits, not economic pursuits, like cultivating the next leadership in Africa who are friendly to China and to exchange ideas about governance and so on. So there is an effort, clear effort out of Beijing to try to do something soft, kind of in the arena of soft power, something like soft squishy kind of stuff. But it's kind of important in the long run. That's not necessarily go for pennies. Dollars. But what that strategy is going to be translated to become operationalized, or how well it will be implemented, is a big question.
Let me just add one point also to that. I basically agree with what's been said on this, but with maybe a slightly different approach to it. China did issue in 2006 a white paper, which was its Africa policy. And if you accept the white paper for what it is, it's a fairly carefully laid out policy document that lays down a strategy such as governments often do. In fact, I would argue that this strategy is more comprehensive than anything the United States has issued on Africa in recent years. So in that sense, there is a document out there that tries to put forth a strategy document. But the problem is that sometimes documents are not always implemented as they are written, and they certainly don't suggest the kinds of tension that you get between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce over who should be controlling aid, for example, to Africa. They don't cover a lot of other disconnects within the implementation of the policy. But I think, in all fairness, there is a document there in any event.
I want to especially thank the others. Sorry.
Thanks. My name is Yang Xu. I'm a PhD student at Harvard University. So I have one question first for all of the panelists. One thing I think is missing here is we've talked a lot about China's strategy and policies in Africa. What about Africa's China policy? So I'm interested. Can Africa come up with a more enlightened China policy, both at national level, regional level, perhaps at AU level?
All right, let me quickly take a first crack at this, because I actually haven't I thought about this for a while after my very impressive trip. I cannot tell you how beautiful Africa really is and how colorful it is. So go to Africa by all means. But anyway, not illegal immigrants, but that's a few words. I think the Africans do not have a unified policy to China, just by the sheer numbers, 54 countries we're talking about. But the rulers, generally, as I mentioned, they all like Chinese. They want more. The money without nanny. It's great, right? They all love that. But in practice, I have detected, as I reported at the end of my speech, from the case of Zimbabwe, which is not really isolated. You see that in Ghana, you see that in Kenya, you see that in Tanzania as well, where you see the African leaders quickly adopt Chinese way of dealing with Chinese. That is, we talk nicely, we treat you well in the airport, and it looks like, oh, you come to Beijing now, right? Not Harare. But in practice, they try to squeeze the Chinese as hard as possible and try to treat the Chinese actually, as I said, I used a phrase which is probably exaggerated, second-class foreigners, right? Judging by the visa case. And also, they actually sometimes use force. With them in Ghana, they literally shot the Chinese illegal miners to death, right? So some senior leaders in private, they quietly mentioning they do all kinds of things to control, squeeze the Chinese. So Chinese are far from being a colonial masters at all. They're not treated as masters. They're treated as kind of a, come with money, work for us, but we try to control you and try to squeeze you out. And the Chinese feel that way. You told the Chinese miners, they feel that same way too. And they started to complain, why Beijing cannot help us more? So that may tie into the earlier comments made by Shinn and others. The Chinese may become more actively involved, even militarily, because 2 million Chinese people on the ground now. Their interests are going to be at stake, and they're making demands, right? That in Ghana case again. So to really summarize this, the Africans, the wishful thinking, if you will, of is Chinese come in to compete with the Westerners. That's great, and we can have a bargaining position. That's actually their strategic goal, if you will.
Yeah, it is true that the Africans don't have unified policy towards China, and actually I did some work in this area about the options available to Africa. And my suggestion, one suggestion I made was to learn from Southeast Asian nations, how they dealt with China. That was the part of the topic of my paper 2 years ago, African Studies Association presentation. In short, I can summarize the strategies I suggested. One is what is called organic solidarity. That is basically speaking in one voice to China. Some of these strategies are difficult to implement, but theoretically that is one. Another is diversification. Inviting in other powers too, including Japan, so that these powers would counter each other, as well, and also strategic solidarity, uniting with other countries, countries in Latin America as well as Asia. And so, in fact, there are also lessons that could be learned from Europe. Europe speaks to China in multiple voices, in the sense that EU has one position. For example, when one organ of EU condemns China's human rights policy, EU member states trade with China. There is no contradiction, there. So Africa could learn some lessons from Europe as well, dealing with China. So I agree with my colleagues there that Africa doesn't yet have a unified policy, and in fact, this Sino-optimism which I described today, trying to challenge, it is in the long-term interest of Africans to try to dilute that optimism, because someday, they will be disappointed, because people, like Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe doesn't want to have relations with any other country other than China, for instance. So those are the kind of strategies which are not in the long-term interest of Africa.
Thank you. Based on my field experience, I think there's a great struggle between, for African leaders, there's a great struggle between short-term interests and long-term interests. So they might have the long-term vision what their country needs, but they also need to meet the near-term desire of to create economic growth and to focus on, for example, issues like selling natural resources. But it's also a process. I would say that more and more African leaders are coming to the realization of what their country really needs. And that's why you see that the African countries, at the beginning, they are focused on what we call the resources curse, natural resources exploitation. And then in the second phase, they move a little bit more towards the infrastructure development to create a foundation for their economic development. And now their demands for China leans more towards job creation, creating employment opportunities for their youth population. And that's what has pushed China to focus more, especially pushed President Xi Jinping to focus more on investment in manufacturing and agricultural industries. On the regional level, I'm not entirely optimistic that Africa will act as a whole vis-à-vis China, not in the near future.
I agree with the comments that have already been made in terms of Africa at this point does not have a unified strategy towards China, but frankly, it's unrealistic to expect it to have that. 54 different governments have to agree upon major policies. On the other hand, there is one process out there that is helping to some extent to encourage the Africans to come up with at least some general principles for interacting with China. It's called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It's a creation by China, actually, although China says it was Africa's idea to create it. Began in the year 2000. It has a permanent secretariat in both Addis Ababa and Beijing. At the summit level, chief of state level or ministerial level, it meets every 3 years. The next meeting will be in 2015 in Africa. And it has created some very loose structure of principles that the African leaders can come together at the summit meeting, present to the Chinese and say, these are the general kinds of things we want from you. So in that sense, there is some coordination going on. But any organization that only meets at the summit level every 3 years can only do so much.
All right. I would like to especially thank the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network, which helped me get in touch with a lot of these scholars. I know there's a lot of scholars in the network who wanted to hear this panel and will be made available online. And thank all of our panelists and all for attending. We have the David Rossi Memorial Lecture next.